The Romans had never given any thought to a navy, yet when they had once conceived the project, they took it in hand so boldly that, before getting any experience in such matters, they immediately engaged the Carthaginians, who for generations had held undisputed command of the sea. A quote from Polybius, the Greek historian, who wrote of the Punic Wars in his famous book, popularly called The Rise of the Roman Republic. Welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 13th episode in the Roman Empire series. We are still in the period of the Roman Republic, just entering into the First Punic War. The last episode described how the Romans, the Carthaginians, and the Greeks of Syracuse all came to blows in the early years of the 3rd century BC. It is 264 BC now, and Hiero has made a fateful alliance with Carthage to help expel the Romans from Sicily. But the Romans themselves have only just arrived on that island symbolically as of yet, having taken the city of Messana under their protection, along with its renegade mercenary overlords, the Mamertines. That symbol of protection will soon become a Roman fist. The Senate decided that year, for reasons that historians may never really know or understand, to send a consul and his army to Messana, and Carthage chose to send a general to the town of Lilybaeum in western Sicily to recruit and gather local forces to defend their financial and diplomatic interests. Now, this all began as a dispute between the mercenaries turned landlords in Messana and the last strong remnant of Greek culture in the western Mediterranean at Syracuse. But just as Serbia and Bosnia were soon forgotten after the First World War turned into a global quagmire of mud and death, so too do the Mamertines and the Greeks fade into the background as these two great peoples, the Romans and the Carthaginians, not spoken of in the annals of Western history until now, come to the foreground, knives drawn. Now, before I fade into the background and let these combatants entertain you, let me remind you once more to visit my website at western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org, where you can find all the episodes of all my series of podcasts, and you can also buy some Western Traditions merchandise on the shopping page. Or you can support my work directly with a contribution through the PayPal or Patreon buttons. Patreon supporters get early access to the latest episodes, as well as behind-the-scenes looks into podcast production, and you can also ask questions and make suggestions about the future direction of the podcast. The Western Traditions Podcast is available on Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and other platforms. Wherever you listen, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. These are easy, free ways to support my work. And now, let's get back to ancient Sicily and the opening blows of the First Punic War. We know so little about the First Punic War that we do not even really know who declared war and upon whom. We know that in the spring of 264 BC, a consul by the name of Appius Claudius Caudex was sent south from Rome with his consular army to handle the matter. This would have been after May 1st, when the consuls for each year were chosen. As our study of the war progresses, we will see a steady, routine change of consuls, just as described in earlier episodes on Roman government. Each year, with few exceptions, new consuls will be elected on May 1st, even as the war raged, and the new consuls sent to take over from those in the field. The old consuls, if they had not been killed or captured in combat anyway, these were sent back to Rome, their accomplishments to be judged and either rewarded or punished there. We should take note of certain cultural differences between the Romans and the Carthaginians here. Roman consuls will be returned and judged. Failures will be admonished. Successes will usually be rewarded with public triumphs, that is, a parade in honor of the victorious consul, as triumphs were described in previous episodes. But Carthage will treat generals with a somewhat heavier hand. Failures, especially particularly bad ones, will often be answered with torture or even crucifixion. Roman generals who simply fail to perform will suffer a certain public shame, but Carthaginian generals are literally fighting for their lives. Anyway, Claudius came south with just the one consular army, perhaps 20,000 men. That Rome did not send both consuls with their armies speaks volumes about their perception of the matter, and this fact has long convinced historians that Rome did not foresee the magnitude of the consequences involved in jumping into this conflict. Perhaps they simply saw it as a matter of making a show of support for a new ally. Meanwhile, Carthage also does not seem to have taken the matter very seriously either. They sent one general, Hanno, son of Hannibal, to Sicily that year. And when I say one general, I mean just one general. He didn't even take a body of Carthaginian troops with him. Hanno's orders instead were to mobilize local garrisons in Sicily and to support Hiero of Syracuse as best he could. Hiero, in the meantime, had besieged the city of Messana. When Claudius and his Roman legionaries arrived in southern Italy, they came to the town of Rhegium, known today as Reggio, which was already under Rome's control, on the toe of the boot of Italy, just a few miles from Messana in Sicily. There was just one major problem, though. Those few miles of separation were composed of ocean, and Rome had no navy. I have spoken about this before, that Rome was without any fleet. It seems hard to believe, but it's true. In the late 4th century BC, Rome had put together a small fleet for a war sometime around 311 BC, but this force had never been properly utilized, and it is assumed that by this time, nearly 60 years later, it had been disbanded. There was something about sailing that was just un-Roman. So in order to bring the might of Rome to Messana's defense, Claudius had to put together a fleet of commandeered civilian ships and run his troops over in the middle of the night, risking it all on a bet that the Carthaginians would not be able to stop them. And they were not able. Not only was it extremely difficult to blockade a city without a nearby port to support such ships as ancient navies had at that time, the truth was that Carthage was not even exactly sure how seriously to treat this intervention by Rome. Hanno had even sent diplomats to speak with Claudius when he first arrived in Rhegium, to try to convince him to stay out of the conflict. When the Romans jumped across the straits, the Carthaginians were probably caught off guard. Carthage did not see this as a knife fight yet. Now, as I said before, we know little about the details of the conflict, especially here at the beginning. When Claudius went back to Rome the following year, Messana was still in Roman hands. And as for the Mamertines, they have moved to the back seat now. The war is about to be much bigger than the mere matter of their independence. And as for their independence, that too is gone. Messana is now Roman. Now, Polybius and some others tell us about great field victories by this consul Claudius, even that he attacked Syracuse itself, yet history does not record a triumph in Rome for him, so this seems doubtful. Perhaps the Greeks and the Carthaginians besieging the city simply disbanded once they realized that there was a Roman legion behind those walls and not just a ragged band of ex-mercenaries. But there must have been some fighting, because we know that, looking ahead to the next year, Hiero will have some Roman prisoners of war to exchange. What we do know is that now the war was on. The next year, Rome sent both new consuls and their armies to Sicily. These quickly laid siege to Syracuse, and Hiero just as quickly saw that it was time that he too, like the Mamertines, should recede from the stage and take his place in the audience and let the main actors take the foreground. This tyrant of Syracuse asked for peace, and the Romans were happy with that resolution. Syracuse became an ally of Rome, and now Hiero, who had started the war asking for Carthaginian aid against the encroaching barbarian Romans, ended his part in the conflict as a faithful ally of Rome. Now, this all may seem a little humiliating, but Hiero is remembered fondly by history, and we ourselves might take a lesson from this when we try to convince ourselves that war is a solution. Hiero would continue to rule peacefully in his city for decades to come. In fact, he would not die until 215 BC, nearly 50 years later, when the man was in his 90s, and on his death, Syracuse would still be a proud bastion of Greek culture, as well as a part of Rome's growing empire. Now, as for what happened to Syracuse after his death, that is a story for another episode. This story, though, continues. It might have ended here, though. Carthage and Rome could have easily wound things up here. They could have made a treaty, exchanged hostages, the usual run of things. But Carthage could not let this reverse go unanswered. She had lost face before her allies, and some cities in Sicily had now gone over to Rome. Yet it seems likely that Carthage was still not planning on any sort of massive war effort. More likely, Carthage saw that it ruled the sea, and that it could wear the Romans down and bring Rome to the bargaining table a little bit chastened and ready to divide things up a little more equitably. After all, the Romans wouldn't sacrifice so much blood and treasure just to defend their honor, would they? Perhaps historian Brian Caven sums it up best. Quote, Carthaginian nobles were unmoved by the prospect of glory, and they thought in terms of profit and loss. They failed to appreciate that their Roman counterparts, uninterested in commerce and unversed in its rules, might be prepared to go on fighting for something that was going to bring them little quantifiable profit. Unquote. And so now, strangely perhaps, it was Rome who succeeded to the title of defender of Greek values and culture, because they were now unexpectedly allied with Hiero and Syracuse against the Carthaginians, who now became perceived as the barbarians. That at least is how things were eventually perceived, that Rome came to the defense of all things quote-unquote civilized and Greek against the barbaric Carthaginians. Now, I spent a good deal of time in the last episode myself coming to the defense of the Carthaginians, who, as a result of this conflict, are almost universally panned as a sort of horrid, vicious, backward people who burned their babies alive and enslaved their neighbors in Africa. Furthermore, they were obsessed with money instead of honor. Now, this is a podcast about Western history and culture, and let there be no doubt, I am a proud Westerner. Ultimately, no matter how leniently I may feel about the Carthaginians, I am glad that Rome won this war. I don't think that I would like to have lived in the world that would have followed upon Carthage rather than Rome taking control of Europe. But I also desire to be fair, to be just, and I think that this moment in the war deserves some scrutiny, actually for a number of reasons, really, and not just because the Romans may have smeared the Carthaginian name. For example, in earlier episodes, I described how the Roman gods and their mythology, as we perceive them now in our textbooks, are a sort of odd amalgam of ideas and concepts that don't always really fit together. As a child, learning about the Roman gods, I was led to believe that the Romans simply worshipped the same gods as the Greeks, but called them different names for the most part. And I hope that this podcast has dispelled that idea, that fallacy, if any of you shared it at some time. But I bring it up again because the synthesis of Greek and Roman mythologies may have begun here as Rome and Greece became politically involved as allies. I suspect that the Romans, may have felt two ways about the Greeks, much as Americans, especially in the last century, felt two ways about Europe, particularly about places such as France, for example. In the early 20th century, young American men and women of culture and class always learned French and appreciated French culture. By the time I was in school in the late 20th century, this attitude had dissipated quite a bit, but earlier generations of the college-educated read French plays, often in French, and recited French poetry. And when they traveled to France, and they drank French wine, and they loitered in Parisian cafes. It may be hard to believe, but even hard-charging, brash warriors like General George Patton were Francophiles, that is, lovers of all things French. That proud warrior spoke French fluently and was ardent about liberating France from the quote-unquote barbarians who had invaded it. And there again, we see how the barbarian epithet continues to be used throughout history. It is used in our very day, even as we bomb ancient civilizations and tell ourselves how backward they are. But these same Americans in the last century, and others perhaps less cultured, were also frustrated by the French, and they disliked, even detested aspects of French culture. The French surrender in World War II and their fractious relationship with the Allies after the war were touted as signs that French character was both weak and untrustworthy. And I suspect that the Romans ultimately had a similar ongoing relationship with the Greeks. Greek culture, and particularly Greek thought, were admired by many in the intelligentsia of Rome. Greece had not only produced great literature in the forms of Homer's epics and the many Greek plays, they had also produced incredible creative minds in the realms of philosophy, science, and math. So Romans, with their Spartan approach to life and their gods who were virtually invisible energies and impulses rather than anthropomorphic beings who intervened in daily life, they must have felt a little self-conscious as they absorbed more and more Greek ideas. The Greeks were so poetic, so passionate, so gifted in the fine arts. And yet the Greeks were irritating, unable, from the Roman perspective anyway, to stick to agreements, to keep their word, always playing both sides against the middle. Recall, if you will, the character of men like Themistocles, as I described in my Greek series of podcasts. And they were so emotional, and their philosophers were a bunch of ne'er-do-wells who pretended to be complex and who substituted words for deeds. Nevertheless, the love affair begins here, the emotional bond between Rome and Greece. Like all of the most dramatic of such affairs, the partners do not always get along. They are drawn to each other, perhaps, by their polarities. Many Roman writers, such as Cicero and Cato, will lament the infusion of Greek manners and thought into Roman culture and bewail the slow erosion of the traditional Stoic Roman character. But I'm getting ahead of myself. All of this drama will unfold over the coming centuries. It's just valuable to note a key moment like this when the Greek and Roman civilizations begin that centuries-long cultural dance. And Rome now becomes the symbol of civilization. And conversely now, just as the Romans ascend in the public eye to the role of defender of high culture, the Carthaginians, who had been the bastion of civilization in the Western Mediterranean for centuries, are now becoming perceived, at least at our late date, as something wicked and base. St. Augustine was Bishop of Hippo in the 5th century AD. Hippo was a Roman city, but it had been a Carthaginian city many centuries before, having been founded by Phoenician explorers sometime before 1000 BC. And Augustine, even in his time, was well aware of the city's history and of Carthaginian history, and he himself, while a Roman citizen, was most likely of African origin, maybe Berber or Numidian, and possibly also had Carthaginian in his background, in his genetic background. Now, this Augustine, whose written works are still treasured today, tells us that the Carthaginians had written down many wise things and much history. From him and from others, we get the idea of a vast, creative, flourishing society which produced art and literature and more. However, we today have no idea what Augustine and these others are talking about. Some of the Carthaginian writings may have survived to Augustine's day, but they did not last until our own. And this erasure seems fitting in a way, given the perception of Carthage that remains to us now as a place where the furnaces of Moloch burned round the clock, consuming the flesh of innocent infants. Well, we know that this extreme perception of Carthage is almost certainly unmerited. Consider now the power of this particular moment in history, this moment when Rome took Greece under its wing. This event didn't simply elevate Rome to the extent that now, as the social media meme tells us, every Western man thinks about Rome at least once per day. This reversal of roles also began the obliteration of a society, such that Carthage is now nearly forgotten. It's just some tumbled ruins in North Africa, and the name only brings to mind infanticide. In the spring of 262 BC, the Carthaginians sent Hannibal, son of Gisgo, to Acragas, which was the second greatest city in Sicily after Syracuse. This time, Carthage did not send a lone general to organize local militias. They had spent the winter recruiting men from Spain and Gaul, and now this fresh mercenary army landed with a Carthaginian general on Sicilian soil, ready to fight. But the Romans wasted no time. That year, 2 Roman consuls arrived in Sicily with their full armies and immediately marched to the city of Acragas and laid siege to it. The industrious Romans surrounded the city with siege works and even fortified camps. In response to this response, Carthage mobilized even more men, and late in the year, in November or even December, they landed an additional 50,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 war elephants in western Sicily. This was probably, as far as we can tell, the first ever field use of elephants by the Carthaginians. Now this army marched to attack the Romans in their camps and in their siege works surrounding the city of Acragas. The Romans only barely survived the initial assault, having to continue their siege of the city while simultaneously fighting the enemy armies sent to relieve that city. Months then passed after the initial battle as the 2 forces in the field sat in their camps and watched each other carefully. Finally, knowing that the Carthaginian force inside the walls was desperate and that the Romans were probably weakened by hunger due to the disruption of their supply lines, the general of this new Carthaginian army decided to risk it all on a general battle. It was a mistake. Again, the Carthaginians underestimated Roman tenacity. The half-starved Romans held the city under siege with some of their forces and fielded the rest of the army to face the Carthaginians. They were unfazed by the presence of elephants and routed the enemy mercenaries. The Carthaginian forces inside the city took the opportunity to break out and escape westward with the other fleeing army. The victorious Romans sacked the city, but they were too exhausted to chase the enemy. And so now a stalemate ensued. The Romans held the eastern part of the island and the Carthaginians the western. This went on for a year until the Romans made another bold move, one that tested their own natural conservatism. You see, until now, the Romans had been carefully shuttling all their troops into Sicily across the Straits of Messina, which they could manage to do without a navy since they held both coastlines. But as the opening years of this war passed, even the Senate, the soul of conservatism and tradition, realized that without a fleet, they would never be able to challenge Carthage adequately. It was time to innovate. The spring of 260 passed as the Romans constructed 100 quinqueremes. These were seagoing sailed vessels that were also powered, allegedly, by 5 banks of oars. In the Greek series of podcasts, you may have heard me reference triremes, which in the previous century had been the standard form of naval vessel with 3 banks of oars. I will not go too far down the rabbit hole here myself, but you might be interested in the mystery surrounding this type of vessel, the quinquereme. We have a lot of knowledge about the more ancient trireme, but the quinquereme and many ships' designs that followed remain obscure for us today. We might naturally assume that quinquereme means 5 banks of oars, since trireme meant 3 banks. But we have no idea about how this could have realistically worked, these 5 banks, and some scholars speculate that the Latin word referring to 5 here, quinque, may have really meant 5 men per oar or something else. Regardless, not only did the Romans suddenly dare to build a fleet, they built a fleet of the newest ship design known and set out to challenge Carthage at sea. And they didn't take years to do this. This happened within a matter of months at most. The Senate was probably provoked to this move not simply by a desire to meet Carthage on her own ground, but also due to the fact that Carthage had begun to raid the Roman coast. Remember that Carthage controlled the island of Sardinia in those days, and from there they could wreak havoc on Roman coastal trade and even really threaten invasion, though it seems very unlikely that the Carthaginians themselves at this point would have considered such a drastic move. But the true genius of this move by Rome is seen in the invention of the corvus. Now, Rome could be as bold as they wanted, but they knew very well that the Carthaginians were simply better sailors, and that in any initial encounter anyway, these descendants of Phoenicia, they were going to handle them better, more dexterously, with more maneuverability than the Romans possibly could. The Romans were absolutely confident against any enemy on the battlefield, but on the water, they were literally on uncertain ground. So instead of vainly trying to be better sailors than the Carthaginians, the Romans brought the battlefield to sea. The word corvus means raven in English. The Roman quinquiremes that set out that year all had this strange device, the corvus, mounted on their bows. No doubt, when the Carthaginians first saw them, they had no idea what they were. A corvus was a 13-foot-long ramp with a great spike at the far end. Circling enemy ships and firing missiles at them or deftly ramming into one in an attempt to sink it, this required a fine quality of seamanship that the Romans simply did not possess. So their solution was to simply run straight at the Carthaginian ships and release the spring that held back this corvus in a restrained position, straight upright on the deck of the Roman vessel. The spike on the end of that ramp slammed down onto the nearby deck of the enemy, securing the ships together. And guess what? A horde of heavily armed Roman legionaries came screaming over the ramp, bringing brutal death to your highly skilled but lightly armed sailors. And this is what happened that summer when the Carthaginians brought some 130 of their own ships to Mylae, known today as Milazzo, a town not 20 miles as the bird flies from Messana on the northern coast of Sicily. Here the Carthaginian fleet met the Romans and lost 50 ships before retreating from the bloodbath that followed. And thus, in one day, the balance of naval power in the Western Mediterranean changed forever. It was not that the Carthaginians were so soundly and completely defeated. They had many more ships, they had many more sailors, they had plenty of money, and they had ingenuity of their own. They would recover from this loss and build more ships and train more sailors. But it had been centuries since anyone had soundly defeated the Carthaginians in even a single sea battle. For the first time, their naval supremacy had been challenged, and indeed, that day marked a definitive turning point. Though it was not clear at the time, Carthage was going to lose this war. (256 BC), the war and the arms race have continued, and Roman boldness is once again on display. This is no longer a fight for Sicily. This is a fight for both dominance and for survival. The situation has become much like that outlined by Pericles at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, when he tried to convince the uncertain among his compatriots about the need for the war. It was not about winning resources or territory anymore, he told them. It was not about spreading democracy. The war was about survival. They could be victors or they could be slaves. There was no longer anything in between. And the same was perhaps now clear to the Romans, even if Carthage had yet to grasp this. So the Senate ordered the building of over 300 ships, most of them battleships, but many of them troop transports and supply ships as well, including ships to carry cavalry horses. And they set out to invade Africa. Yes, the Romans were going to bring the war to Africa. The Greeks of Syracuse had done the same decades before, and perhaps their Greek allies had inspired them to make this daring move. Carthage knew that the Romans had prepared a large fleet. They may or may not have known its intentions initially. The Romans had assembled an invasion force on the south coast of Sicily, and it was to here that the Roman fleet sailed to board those troops and cross the ocean to invade the Carthaginian homeland. The Carthaginians sent a slightly larger fleet to meet these Roman ships, and the two fleets encountered one another not long after the troops had boarded and the fleet had set forth. The two armadas met near a point named for Mount Ecnomus on the coast of southern Sicily. The result was another humiliation. The Romans seized over 60 Carthaginian ships. They sank another 30. At a loss of only 24 of their own, and their transports were preserved. The Romans did have to sail back to Messana briefly to regroup, but that was only a slight delay. They soon resumed their cruise to Africa, where the Carthaginians now awaited an invasion. The Romans landed without significant resistance at Clupea, an African city less than 100 miles as the bird flies from the great city of Carthage itself. The plan apparently was not so bold as to call for the actual capture of the enemy capital necessarily. Even the daring Romans may have known that there's such a thing as expecting a little too much. Furthermore, Clupea and the surrounding area were not capable of supporting the perhaps 100,000 or more soldiers, sailors, support personnel, and horses in the task force. Nor could the city's port berth and service all the ships. So one of the consuls, Marcus Atilius Regulus, was left behind with 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 ships. His job was to harass, raid, and burn the countryside estates of rich Carthaginian nobles, to threaten supply lines to the city of Carthage, and to encourage the locals to revolt against their masters. The other consul returned to Rome to prepare for whatever came next. There was, after all, still a war in Sicily. The consul left in Africa, Regulus, is remembered for many things. He was brave, he was resourceful, he was tenacious, he was a more than capable field commander. And he proved this by advancing all the way to Tunis, a city something like just 10 miles from the city of Carthage itself, with such a comparably small force. It was incredible that Regulus did this. And here he could even more dangerously threaten Carthaginian survival. But war historians criticize Regulus for not taking greater advantage of the situation and bringing about, perhaps, an uprising of slaves and or a more destructive invasion of the Numidians, who were the peoples of the African interior and whom the Carthaginians constantly had to fight off. And we're not sure about just what terms Regulus may have offered to Carthage, but they were apparently too extreme for them to accept. Did he ask for more than just the evacuation of Sicily? We do not know. But now, whatever overtures Regulus may have made, even the merchants of Carthage were determined to fight on. However, they had already seen that their own strategies and tactics had failed horribly against the Roman legions, so they ignored their own generals and reached out for help among their mercenary leaders. And here, the lasting value and influence of the Greeks appears again in history. A Spartan by the name of Xanthippus was chosen to reorganize the Carthaginian forces. He did so and deployed into the field a rested, transformed army in the early spring of 255 BC, when Regulus was still consul in command of the Roman forces in Africa. This rejuvenated Carthaginian force quickly bested the Romans, probably by relying on their superiority in cavalry. The Romans had to flee all the way back to their tiny coastal base in Clupea, and there only barely managed to survive a Carthaginian siege. In May of 255 BC, new consuls were elected in Rome. They launched another grand fleet of more than 300 ships and came to the rescue of the stranded legions. After deftly neutralizing a Carthaginian fleet meant to stop them, they anchored off Clupea and evacuated the troops and headed for home. All in all, this must have involved hundreds of thousands of men, because the Roman troops and the sailors of the 40 ships already at Clupea would have required plenty of support personnel, and the 300 ships that came to rescue them would have been manned by many tens of thousands of sailors at least. Some think the total number involved in the operation would have been beyond 100,000. This was Rome's Dunkirk. Except Dunkirk in AD 1940 involved the miraculous and ultimately successful rescue of soldiers stranded on an enemy shore. Few of these Romans, sailors or soldiers, ever made it home. A storm off the coast of southern Sicily caught the returning fleet off guard. Most of the ships sank. Some 80 total ships appear to have finally reached Syracuse, and these may have contained less than 30,000 survivors, though we have to remember that records are poor for this period. Nevertheless, Rome's finest had been defeated in a foreign land, and then, after fleeing a battlefield reversal, they had been sent to the bottom of the sea. There is a pretty Roman legend about this event, pretty anyway in the eyes of a classically Roman Stoic. Regulus, the Roman consul in command during the defeat, you see, he had been captured in battle by the Carthaginians. And according to our best knowledge, he died in captivity some years later. The historian Polybius does not have anything further to say on the matter. But a legend became popular after the war, and it goes like this. Regulus was offered contingent freedom by his Carthaginian captors. He was asked to go to Rome and to make the case for peace. But then, on his honor, he was required to return to his prison in Carthage to await the results of his embassy, whatever those results were, for war or for peace. Regulus accepted the mission, and when he arrived in Rome, he told the Senate to continue the war. He argued that Carthage was weak and that Rome could easily destroy her. Then, like the virtuous Roman that he was, Regulus got back in a ship and returned to Carthage and to prison. His jailers there, when they learned of his words before the Senate, tortured him to death. While even many ancient historians consider the tale to be fictitious, I bring it up here as another example of the Roman ideal. Whether or not Regulus did this really is immaterial to my point. What matters is that Romans taught this as an example of virtue. This is how a man should act. Regulus, as described in this legend, was not duplicitous. Another man might have returned to Rome, made the case for war, and then gone back on his word and remained safe in Rome while preparing for a renewed attack. But Regulus spoke honestly with the Senate and then, just as honestly and virtuously, got back in a ship and kept his word to the Carthaginians. Because your word is no good if you only keep it with your allies and your friends. There's a similar sentiment in the gospel. Jesus tells his followers that it's not particularly admirable to love your friends and family. I mean, everybody does that. It's loving those that hate you that requires effort. For the Romans, virtue, honesty, bravery, endurance, obedience, all these were only admirable if applied 100% of the time, not just when it suited you. And so, even as the war took a terrible turn for Rome, just when it looked like Carthage was on her knees, Rome forged on. Her bravery was nothing important when the odds were in her favor. It was now that her endurance and her fortitude could have a moment to shine. Tens of thousands of her best men had gone to their deaths on the ocean floor. Most of her new fleet was wrecked. Carthage, the great power of the Western Mediterranean, was resurgent, building more ships and recruiting more mercenaries. In the spring of 254 BC, the Roman Senate, true to form, would elect another 2 consuls, just like they did every year, and they would order the building of more than 200 new ships and the recruitment and training of new men to man them. As we would say in today's wording, the Romans were all in. Until next time, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.